Why prisoners are starving despite the government spending millions on food. Subscribe, like, share and comment for more videos. The money was there. Every single dollar of it. Accounted for, approved, and signed. The food never arrived. In the fall of 2017, a paralegal working for a non-profit prison oversight organization in the southeastern United States began receiving letters. Not unusual, her office received hundreds of letters from inmates every month. Requests for legal assistance, complaints about conditions, appeals for representation. But these letters were different. They weren't asking for lawyers. They were asking for food. The first letter described a dinner consisting of 2 slices of bread, a spoonful of canned beans, and a cup of water. No protein. No vegetable. No caloric substance beyond what a child's snack might provide. The inmate who wrote it had been incarcerated at a privately operated correctional facility in the state for 14 months. He weighed, by his own account, 41 pounds less than he had at intake. He wasn't writing to complain. He was writing because he didn't know how much longer he could keep working his assigned labor detail on what he was being given to eat. The paralegal, a woman named in subsequent court documents only as a case coordinator for the organization, flagged the letter and set it aside. By the end of that week, she had flagged 9 more just like it. All from the same facility. All describing the same meals. All written within the same 30-day window. She didn't know it yet, but she was looking at the edge of something much larger. To understand what was happening, it helps to understand how food contracts work inside the American private prison system. When a state government contracts with a private prison company to house inmates, the contract includes a per-diem rate, a fixed dollar amount paid per inmate per day to cover housing, supervision, healthcare, and food. That rate varies by state and contract, but the food component typically represents a defined portion of the per diem, sometimes specified, sometimes bundled into a general operational cost. The private prison company then subcontracts food service to a third-party vendor. That vendor is paid a separate contract rate to provide a specified number of meals per day meeting minimum nutritional standards established by state or federal guidelines. On paper, the system has 2 layers of financial accountability. In practice, both layers have the same vulnerability. The money flows in one direction and the food flows in another, and nobody in the middle is required to prove the 2 ever met. The facility at the center of those letters operated under a food service contract worth approximately $3.2 million annually. That figure was publicly available, listed in the state's correctional services procurement database, accessible to anyone with a computer and enough patience to look. The case coordinator looked. Then she looked at the meals being described in the letters. The gap between the 2 was not subtle. It was not a matter of interpretation or nutritional philosophy or budget variance. It was the difference between what a $3.2 million contract should produce and 2 slices of bread with a spoonful of beans. She began building a file. Over the following 6 weeks, she collected 37 letters from inmates at the facility. She cross-referenced the meal descriptions against the nutritional minimums required by the state's Department of Corrections. She requested the facility's most recent food service inspection report through a public records request. The inspection report came back clean. Fully compliant. No deficiencies noted. Signed by an inspector from the state's contracted oversight vendor. She read that report 3 times. Then she pulled the inspector's name and ran it against the state's vendor registration database. The inspection company and the food service vendor shared a registered business address. That detail, a single shared address in a state procurement database, was the first hard evidence that what she was looking at was not negligence. It was a system. The food service vendor responsible for feeding the inmates was connected to the company responsible for confirming the food met standards. The oversight was not independent. It had never been independent. And the state agency responsible for monitoring the contract had either not noticed or had not looked. She filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Corrections Oversight Division. The complaint was acknowledged. A review was scheduled. The review was assigned to an internal audit team. 3 weeks later, that audit team submitted its preliminary findings. The findings noted no material deficiencies in the food service contract. The case coordinator received the findings letter on a Tuesday afternoon. She read it once, set it down. Then she called a contact she had at a regional investigative journalism outlet and told him she needed to meet in person. She brought the file. Of it. What the journalist found when he began independently reviewing the procurement records went further than a shared business address. The food service vendor had been awarded contracts at 11 facilities across 4 states in the preceding 7 years. In 3 of those states, the vendor had also held inspection-related subcontracts either directly or through affiliated entities. In 2 of those states, inmate lawsuits alleging inadequate food provision had been filed, settled confidentially, and sealed. The settlements meant the complaints were resolved. They also meant the findings were never made public. They also meant the vendor continued operating. With new contracts, in new states, the journalist submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the full contract documentation, inspection records, and correspondence between the state agency and the vendor dating back 5 years. The request was acknowledged. A response timeline of 30 business days was provided. On the 28th day, the journalist received a letter informing him that a significant portion of the requested documents had been designated as proprietary commercial information and were exempt from disclosure under the state's public records law. The exemption covered the food service contract's cost breakdown, the specific line items showing how the $3.2 million was allocated, the documents that would have shown exactly how much money was spent on food versus how much was absorbed elsewhere in the contract. Those documents were sealed, but the journalist had been doing this long enough to know that sealed documents leave shadows. He went back to the procurement database. Not to the contract itself, to the amendment records. Every contract modification, every budget adjustment, every approved variance from the original terms. What he found in the amendment records was a number. A single budget reallocation approved in the contract's 2nd year. It moved $340,000 out of the food service line item and into a category listed only as Operational Efficiency Adjustment. The reallocation had been approved by the state agency. It had been approved without a review period. It had been approved on the same date the previous inspection report had been signed. The case coordinator had sent 37 letters to the Oversight Division. The Oversight Division had found no deficiencies. The food contract had been quietly reduced by $340,000. And the vendor was currently bidding on 2 new contracts in adjacent states. When the journalist checked the bid submission dates for those new contracts, he found something that made him stop. Both bids had been submitted the week after the Oversight Division closed the complaint. As if someone had known it was coming. As if someone had known how it would end. The complaint was closed. The contracts were moving forward. And somewhere inside that facility, 37 men were still eating 2 slices of bread for dinner. But when the journalist checked the inspector's certification records, the license that authorized him to sign off on food service compliance in the first place, everything changed. The inspector's certification had expired. Not recently. Not by a few weeks or a filing delay that could be explained away as administrative backlog. By 4 years. The license number listed on every food service inspection report the facility had received for the past 4 years traced back to a certification that had lapsed in 2013. The state required active certification for anyone authorized to sign off on correctional food service compliance. The requirement was not obscure. It was listed in the procurement guidelines, in the vendor contract terms, and in the state's Correctional Services Administrative Code. Every inspection report signed with that license number was, technically, invalid. Every clean bill of compliance the facility had received during that period was signed by someone who was no longer legally authorized to sign it. 4 years of inspections. 4 years of clean reports. 4 years of a $3.2 million annual contract continuing without interruption. The journalist sat with that number for a long time. Then he started counting backward. If the certification had lapsed in 2013 and the vendor had been awarded the facility contract in 2014, then the inspector had been unqualified from the moment the contract began. The state agency that approved the contract had either verified the certification and missed the expiration, or had never verified it at all. Both possibilities pointed to the same place. The oversight system had not failed at a single point. It had never been functioning. He brought the certification records to the case coordinator. She looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she said something that would later appear in the court documents that emerged from this case. She said it explained why the complaint had been closed so quickly. A proper investigation of the food service contract would have required pulling the inspection records. Pulling the inspection records would have surfaced the expired certification. Surfacing the expired certification would have invalidated 4 years of compliance reports. Invalidating 4 years of compliance reports would have exposed the state agency to liability for every contract renewal it had approved during that period. The complaint hadn't been dismissed because there was nothing there. It had been dismissed because there was too much. The journalist filed a second FOIA request. This one targeted the state agency's internal communications, emails, memos, meeting minutes, related to the vendor contract during the certification lapse period. The response came back faster than expected. Most of the requested communications were released. One category was withheld entirely: internal communications between the agency's Contract Compliance Division and its legal counsel during the 30-day period following the case coordinator's original complaint. The legal counsel communications were withheld under attorney-client privilege. The 30-day window they covered was the exact period during which the complaint had been reviewed and closed. What the released communications did show was a pattern of correspondence between the state agency and the food service vendor that had nothing to do with compliance and everything to do with contract renewal. During the same period the complaint was under review, agency staff and vendor representatives had exchanged at least 14 emails discussing the terms of the contract's upcoming renewal cycle. Pricing adjustments. Service scope modifications. Timeline for bid resubmission. Business as usual. While 37 inmates were documented as receiving nutritionally inadequate meals. While an oversight complaint was sitting in the review queue. While an expired certification was attached to every inspection report in the file. The case coordinator submitted a second formal complaint. This one went not to the state's Department of Corrections Oversight Division, but to the State Attorney General's office. She included the expired certification records, the FOIA-obtained contract amendment showing the $340,000 reallocation, the procurement database records showing the shared business address, and copies of the original inmate letters, 37 of them, each one describing meals that fell below the caloric minimums required by the contract the state was paying $3.2 million a year to enforce. The Attorney General's office acknowledged receipt. An investigator was assigned. His name appeared in subsequent court documents. His assignment was logged. His first action was to formally request the complete contract file from the Department of Corrections. That request was made on a Wednesday. By Friday of the same week, the investigator had been reassigned to a different case. No explanation was recorded in the case file. A new investigator was assigned the following Monday. The new investigator requested the same contract file. When it arrived, something was different. The case coordinator had kept copies of the procurement database records she had originally pulled, the ones showing the shared business address between the food service vendor and the inspection company. When she compared her copies to the version of those records now contained in the official contract file, she found a discrepancy. The shared address was gone. In the version of the records now held in the official file, the inspection company's registered address was different, a separate suite number in the same building, but distinct enough to break the direct address match that had been the foundation of her original complaint. The database record had been amended. The amendment timestamp showed it had been updated 11 days after she filed her first complaint. 3 days before the complaint was closed. She brought this to the new investigator immediately. He reviewed the discrepancy. He acknowledged it was significant. He told her he would need to verify the amendment through the state's business registration office to establish whether it represented a legitimate address correction or a retroactive modification made in response to the complaint. He submitted that verification request. The business registration office responded within 5 days. Their records showed the inspection company had filed an address amendment, a routine administrative update, 8 months prior to the complaint. The amendment had simply not been reflected in the procurement database until it was manually updated. The update, they confirmed, was standard procedure following a periodic database audit. The audit had been completed, they confirmed, during the same week the complaint was filed. Routine timing, they said. A coincidence of administrative cycles. The investigator noted the explanation in the file. He noted that the business registration office's records supported the vendor's position. He noted that without the shared address as a foundational element, the complaint's primary evidence of structural conflict of interest was significantly weakened. He did not note, and the file did not reflect, that the periodic database audit referenced by the business registration office was scheduled annually, that the previous audit had occurred 10 months prior rather than the standard 12, and that the audit cycle had been moved forward by 2 months for reasons that were not documented in the audit schedule. The case coordinator found that detail herself. 3 weeks later, after the investigator had submitted his preliminary assessment recommending the complaint be referred back to the Department of Corrections for internal resolution, back to the agency that had already closed it once. By this point, the journalist had been working the story for 4 months. He had the expired certification. He had the $340,000 reallocation. He had the amended database record. He had the reassigned investigator. He had the audit timeline discrepancy. What he didn't have was a source willing to speak on the record from inside the system. Everyone he approached either declined, didn't respond, or referred him to public affairs offices that issued identical statements confirming the facility operated in full compliance with all applicable standards. Then, in the 5th month, someone called him. The call came from a number registered to a prepaid phone. The caller identified themselves only as a former employee of the state's Contract Compliance Division. They said they had left the division 18 months earlier. They said they had left because of something they had seen in the contract files. They said they had tried to raise it internally and had been told, in direct terms, to leave it alone. Then they said something the journalist had not expected. They told him the $340,000 reallocation wasn't the only one. There had been others. Not at this facility. At 7 others across the state. Same vendor. Same inspection affiliate. Same reallocation category, operational efficiency adjustment. Different facilities, different contract years, different amounts. But the same pattern. And the same state agency approving every single one. The total, across all 7 facilities, across the years the former employee could document from memory, was not $340,000. It was closer to $4 million. Moved out of food service line items. Across facilities housing a combined population of more than 6,000 inmates. The journalist asked the former employee if they had documentation. There was a pause on the line. They said they had kept copies of certain records when they left. They said they had kept them because they were afraid of exactly what appeared to be happening. They said they would consider sharing them, but that they needed time. They would call back within the week. They never called back. The journalist tried the prepaid number 3 times over the following 10 days. On the 11th day, the number was disconnected. He filed a request with the Attorney General's office to determine whether the former employee had ever been identified as a source in the ongoing investigation. The Attorney General's office declined to confirm or deny whether any confidential sources were associated with the case. The case coordinator made her own inquiries through the nonprofit's network of contacts in the state's corrections system. Nobody had heard from the former employee. Nobody knew where they had gone. $4 million. 7 facilities. 6,000 inmates. And the one person who could document all of it had disappeared. In Chapter 3, what the records eventually revealed, what the system was forced to admit, and the one fact buried in the final audit report that nobody in the agency wanted to explain. Some of it came to light. Not all of it. And what remained hidden says more about the system than what was ever disclosed. The former employee came back. Not by phone. Not in person. Through the mail. 11 weeks after the prepaid number went dead, a padded envelope arrived at the nonprofit organization's office addressed to the case coordinator. No return address. Postmarked from a city 3 states away. Inside was a USB drive, a handwritten note with 4 words on it, and nothing else. The 4 words were, the audits were shared. The USB drive contained 214 files. The case coordinator called the journalist within the hour. By that evening, they were sitting together at a table with the files printed and organized by facility, by year, and by contract amendment date. What the former employee had preserved, at personal risk, over an unknown period of time, in a format that suggested careful and deliberate preparation, was not a smoking gun in the traditional sense. It was something more methodical than that. It was a record of how the system had been designed to not catch itself. The 214 files contained internal budget reconciliation documents from 8 privately operated correctional facilities across the state. 7 of them matched the facilities the former employee had described in the phone call. The 8th was new, a facility that had not previously appeared in either the journalist's reporting or the Attorney General's investigation. Across all 8 facilities, the documents showed the same structural pattern repeated with minor variations in timing and amount. A food service contract would be awarded at a rate sufficient to meet state nutritional minimums. Within 12 to 18 months of the contract's start date, a budget amendment would be submitted to the state agency reclassifying a portion of the food service allocation as an operational efficiency adjustment. The amendment would be approved, typically within 5 business days, with no documented review of its impact on meal provision. The reclassified funds would move into a general operational budget category with no line item specificity, meaning the money could be spent on anything the vendor designated as an operational expense. Then, at the next inspection cycle, the facility would receive a clean compliance report, signed, in most cases, by the same inspector whose certification had expired in 2013. The journalist took the documents to a forensic accountant he had worked with on previous investigations. She spent 4 days reviewing them. Her assessment was precise and, in its way, devastating. The total amount reclassified out of food service line items across all 8 facilities, over the period covered by the documents, was $4.1 million. That number aligned almost exactly with what the former employee had cited from memory in the phone call. Which meant the former employee had not been estimating. They had known. They had counted. The forensic accountant made a second observation that the journalist had not anticipated. She noted that the timing of the budget amendments, across all 8 facilities, showed a pattern of coordination that was difficult to attribute to coincidence. The amendments were not filed simultaneously. They were staggered, spread across different quarters, different fiscal years, different contract cycles. But when mapped against the state agency's internal audit schedule, each amendment had been filed and approved during a window that fell between scheduled audits. Not before. Not after. Between. As if whoever was filing them understood exactly when the agency's attention would be directed elsewhere. The journalist brought the full package to the Attorney General's office. Not through the standard submission process. Directly to a senior investigator he had developed a working relationship with over several years of reporting on state government. The senior investigator reviewed the materials over 2 days. On the 3rd day, she called him and said 4 words of her own. She said, "We already have some." The Attorney General's office had, independent of the journalist's reporting and the case coordinator's complaints, been building a parallel investigation for the previous 7 months. It had begun not from inmate letters or procurement database anomalies but from a routine financial audit of the state's correctional services budget that had flagged an unusual volume of operational efficiency adjustments across multiple vendor contracts. The auditors had not known what the adjustments were masking. They had simply noticed there were too many of them, in too similar a pattern, to be organic. The journalist's documents filled in what the auditors had been unable to access directly. The facility-level budget reconciliations showing exactly where the reclassified money had come from and the inspection reports that had kept the facilities in compliance status throughout. Combined, the 2 bodies of evidence told a complete story. In the spring of 2019, the Attorney General's office filed a civil action against the food service vendor, the affiliated inspection company, and 3 named individuals within the state agency's contract compliance division. The action alleged fraudulent misrepresentation in a government contract, falsification of compliance records, and breach of fiduciary duty to the state. It did not allege criminal conduct. That distinction mattered. Civil liability meant financial penalties. It meant contract termination. It meant, potentially, restitution. It did not mean anyone went to prison for the systematic underfeeding of inmates in 8 facilities over multiple years. The vendors settled 14 months later. The settlement amount was $2.3 million, significantly less than the $4.1 million identified in the Forensic Accounting Review. The difference was attributed to a legal determination that not all of the reclassified funds could be directly proven to have come at the expense of food provision, as opposed to other operational costs within the contract. The 3 individuals named within the state agency received administrative sanctions. 2 were reassigned to non-supervisory roles. 1 retired during the investigation period and was not subject to further action under the state's employment separation policy. The vendor agreed to terminate its contracts at all 8 facilities. The vendor was not barred from bidding on future government contracts. 12 months after the settlement was finalized, a subsidiary entity with a different registered name but overlapping corporate ownership submitted bids for correctional food service contracts in 2 neighboring states. The case coordinator found the bid submissions through a routine procurement database search. She filed formal notifications with both states' attorneys general offices, attaching the settlement documentation and the corporate ownership records showing the relationship between the new bidder and the settled vendor. 1 state paused its bid review pending further investigation. The other state awarded the contract. The inmates at the 8 facilities were never formally acknowledged as injured parties in the civil action. The settlement did not include a restitution component directed at the individuals who had been underfed. Several of them had filed pro-se legal complaints, handwritten, submitted without legal representation, during the years the pattern was operating. Those complaints had been processed through the standard institutional grievance system. Most had been denied at the facility level. A small number had been escalated to the state agency. The state agency had reviewed and closed them. During the same period, the Contract Compliance Division was approving the budget amendments. The case coordinator kept every letter, all 37 from the original facility, and the ones that came in afterward from the other 7 facilities, once word moved through the system that someone outside was paying attention. By the time the civil action was filed, she had collected more than 200 letters describing inadequate meals across the 8 facilities. She submitted them all as exhibits. They were accepted into the record. They were not referenced in the settlement agreement. The journalist published his investigation in a regional outlet with a modest readership. It was picked up by 2 national publications. It generated significant short-term attention. 6 months later, the story had largely moved out of public view. The correctional food service industry continued operating under the same fundamental structure: private vendors, subcontracted inspections, state agencies reviewing their own compliance records, in states across the country. The Per-Diem model that created the financial incentive to reduce food costs while maintaining compliance paperwork remained standard practice in privately operated facilities. The gap between what the contracts promised and what reached the inmates' plates did not close. It simply stopped being covered. The 4 words on the handwritten note, "The audits were shared," referred to something the 214 files ultimately confirmed, but that neither the journalist nor the Attorney General's investigation was able to fully pursue. The internal audit schedules that the vendor had apparently used to time its budget amendments had not been publicly available documents. They were internal state agency planning records. For the vendor to have filed amendments consistently within the windows between audits, someone would have needed access to those schedules. The investigation identified the possibility. It noted it as a line of inquiry. It was not resolved before the settlement closed the case. The question of how the vendor knew when to move the money was never publicly answered. Every morning, in privately operated correctional facilities across the United States, food trays are prepared, distributed, and logged. The logs show compliance. The contracts show millions of dollars allocated for nutritional provision. The inmates eating those meals, or not eating them, have limited ability to formally dispute what they receive, limited access to legal representation to pursue what disputes they do file, and limited confidence that the system reviewing their complaints is independent of the system providing their food. The money exists. The oversight exists on paper. The gap between the two is not an accident. It is, in some cases, a business model. The case coordinator still works at the nonprofit. She still receives letters. They still describe the same meals. 2 slices of bread. A spoonful of beans. A cup of water. The government paid millions. The contracts were signed. The inspections were filed. And somewhere between the budget line and the tray, the food disappeared, systematically, quietly, and in some cases, with the knowledge of the people responsible for preventing exactly that. The settlement is closed. The structure that made it possible is still operating. If this story stayed with you, the next one goes deeper.